day? Awesome. Well, we are super excited that you're here. We've been in this sermon series called It's Gonna Take a Miracle. And we're excited to continue in that today. In this series, we're learning about the miraculous, that God is a supernatural, miracle-working God. We're not only learning to trust God for the miraculous because He is able, but we're also learning that we have a lot to learn about how God works. And sometimes it doesn't happen the way that we think that it should. It doesn't happen the way that we would do it. That leads us to a topic that can be challenging and to one that we don't always talk about a lot at church because we don't always know what to say about it. But it's this topic of what happens when my prayers that I've been praying haven't been answered. What about the miracle that's needed in my life that doesn't seem like it's coming? What about the miracle that I've prayed for weeks and for months and for years? What about the areas that I've trusted God for and I've stood believing that God's going to show up and He has yet to show up in that way? Oftentimes in our lives, the common cold comes and it goes and life goes on. But what about when the sickness lingers or when it turns into a long-term illness? If you've ever had a long-term illness or you've supported someone that has, you know that it's often can be a difficult battle in many ways for a lot of people, not just from the standpoint of the health crisis and situation, but there's people who are sick for a long time and doctors are unable to help them. They're unable to give them the answers that they need. And other people don't always understand it. Other people don't always believe you. And sometimes they quietly wonder if maybe it's a situation that's in your head. And others will wonder what you did to cause it or to deserve it. And it's easy to be opinionated. It's easy to be judgmental with somebody else. All of a sudden, it seems like those people's theology changes a little bit when they get sick and when they don't have the answers. But sometimes these are realities of situations that people deal with who are suffering for a long time, who are going through challenging situations. And it can be a place of great loneliness and of great desperation. And it's easy, even in the midst of it, to wonder where God is. Why hasn't my prayer for healing been answered? Where's the miracle that I've asked God for? Maybe you've found yourself in desperate need and you've cried out to God for help with crippling anxiety and panic attacks. And there's been moments where it's been difficult for you to leave your house. Maybe there's a disease that you or a family member has that's without a cure, without answers. Could be a chronic condition that causes daily pain and discomfort. You try to cope, but it's always there. Maybe today you're even watching this online from a hospital or from home and you feel hopeless. You feel discouraged. There's people here today that you have a family member that's battling addiction and is slowly taking its toll on your family, and you've prayed and you've asked God to move and you've yet to see Him move in that situation. There's severely strained relationships that it seems like they're irreparable. The list goes on and on and on. I can't list them all, but there's some heavy things that maybe you've carried for a long time, that maybe you've had for a while, and you've asked God to move. You believe for God to move. You've prayed for a miracle, but the miracle has yet to come. What do you do when it seems like the miracle you need isn't coming? For some people here today, that's the situation that you're in. You've held on to hope for so long. You've shed tears. You've wondered, when will God answer? If God will answer. And you've seen other people get the miracles that they've prayed for and believed for and that they've needed. And you've tried to be happy for them because the last thing you want is not to be happy for them. But you've also asked, when is my miracle coming? Maybe for years you've gone down for prayer and you've asked others to pray with you for needs and for situations. And after praying over and over and over, it seemed like it was without answer. It's hard to get the courage to even continue going forward for prayer. Maybe it seems to you like it's too late, like it doesn't matter anymore. Maybe you've even come here and you're in a place where you've said, you know what? Don't bother anymore. I'm not going to bother to go forward for prayer anymore. I'm not going to bother to ask about that need or that situation that I have anymore because I've done all that I can do and it seems like there's no help to be had. Now maybe on the other hand, you're here today and you can't relate to any of those situations and that's not your experience. You're not able to identify with that sense of desperation. You're blessed. You've never faced those areas of need that I've mentioned, and I hope that you never will. But I want you to still listen today to this message, and for several reasons. There may be someone in your family or a circle of your friends that are facing a similar challenge, and you need to understand how to love, how to encourage, and how to pray for them. Another reason is because it could be that one day you or someone you love could find yourself in a situation, and what you learn today could be valuable to you in the future. Our church, our desire is to be an outward-focused church. It's one of our values, and we want to build a culture of compassion, and we pray that God will give us opportunities to share our faith and to pray with people that are without answers and that have given up hope or that feel forgotten. And I want you to be ready to be able to share truth in those situations. We're family. That's a part of our vision and values as well. And by God's design, we believe that life is better together. And so when Galatians 6 tells us to carry the burdens of others, and Romans 12 says that we are to rejoice with those who rejoice and to mourn with those who mourn, when one of us faces a challenge, we face it together. So for those reasons, even if you don't feel like this is for you, it's for you. And even if you feel like it's not of immediate personal benefit, it's for you and it will benefit you. We pray that God uses it in you and through you in the days ahead. I want to transition to a story today that's found in Luke chapter 8 and Mark chapter 5. And Mark 5 is where we're going to land today. Easily you can preach this message from either one of those scripture passages. They're very, very similar in the recording of them, but I've just chosen Mark 5 today. There's people that had heard about Jesus. They've heard that he did the miraculous. They came by the multitudes to hear the teachings and to see and to experience him do the miraculous. And there was times that as a result of the people that had heard and the multitudes that came, there was large crowds everywhere that Jesus went. We know that there's times where Jesus had to get on a boat and go to the other side of the lake to get away from the large multitudes of people that would come. And this is one of those situations where Jesus has begun to move in miraculous ways. He's began to move in power, and people are coming to see. And we pick up the story in Mark chapter 5, verse 22 and 23. It says this: Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. And when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. "My little daughter is dying," he said. "Please come and lay your hands on her and heal her so that she can live." There's a lot that's taking place here in the story, but let me give you just a little bit of context here of what's happening in the scripture. Jairus is a synagogue leader. These leaders were a part of a group that by and large opposed Jesus and his teaching. Jesus didn't abide by the strict Sabbath rules and observances that the religious leaders of these synagogues would observe. There were often differences, and those leaders frequently were at odds with Jesus and his followers. If the other leaders of the synagogues had heard that Jairus was begging Jesus for help, it would have likely cost him his position and his status. But Jairus went to Jesus anyway, because so would you if it was your daughter. All that he cared about in this moment was his 12-year-old little girl that was on death's doorstep. So he didn't hesitate, despite the differences, to go to Jesus, and Jesus didn't hesitate either. Jesus had come to bless and to love everyone, even his enemies. So in Mark chapter 5, verse 24, we see that Jesus went with him. And the crowd of people, the multitudes, followed around, crowding around him. There's so many people that are following, and they're pressing in around Jesus and the disciples. And many of them had heard and they'd seen the miraculous things that Jesus had done. And they didn't want to miss seeing anything else. And they're like, "Oh my gosh, this guy came and he wants Jesus to heal his daughter. Let's make sure we don't miss this." And so they're pressing in with Jesus. And they wanted to see Jesus do a miracle firsthand. So this multitude of people pressing in and against each other began to head to Jairus' house. And then the unimaginable happened. At likely what was the worst possible moment for Jairus and for his sick daughter, Jesus was interrupted. And he was interrupted by a woman who had a desperate need. In verse 25, it says this woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. And 12 years is a long time. A lot of things can happen in 12 years. 12 years ago, the Dallas Mavericks won the championship. It hasn't happened since. Probably not going to happen anytime soon. 12 years ago, nobody in the world had heard of COVID. 12 years ago, I had a son in first grade and a daughter in diapers. Wow. She's running the slides today. I'm surprised that she actually put that picture up. Wyoming Cowboys football had won 8 games. They had lost to Nebraska here at home, and they went to the New Mexico Bowl. A little different coach at that time. University of Wyoming men's basketball. They, despite starting the season in some people's mind with a top 25 rank, they were 0-10 in games that mattered. They didn't win a whole lot that year except for a nomination for the worst jersey in basketball that season in 2011. Adele had the top song in the country, Rollin' in the Deep, 12 years ago. Osama bin Laden was killed and became one of the biggest news stories of the year. Prince William marries Kate Middleton at Westminster Abbey. Steve Jobs died. Sam Bennett, who played on the worship team today, was a little smaller then than he is now. Zane thinks that is pretty funny, but he was a little smaller too. But then so was Pastor Brian. Seems like it was a lifetime ago. And for this woman, 12 years of suffering, 12 years of losing blood to an abnormal female cycle over 4,380 days. This would have caused her to be sick, weak, exhausted for most of those 12 years. She was in a situation where only a miracle would do. Verse 26, it says she'd suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she'd spent everything she had to pay them. But she'd gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. She got worse every day for 12 long years. She tried every home remedy she could find on ScrollMD. They didn't have WebMD yet. In addition to that, she no doubt suffered 12 years of advice from well-meaning friends. Have you tried this supplement? Have you tried that diet? Rub this oil on your big toe. Buy this product from me. I've heard it helps with every other person that's had this 12 years suffering that you have. They tell you about their second cousin that had the exact same issue. She never got better. She died. It really gets fun when the advice and the suggestions they give you begin with the words, at least. Well, at least you're alive. At least it doesn't seem to be terminal. You've lived with it for 12 years. At least you have insurance. At least your kids are already grown. If you're talking with someone that's going through a difficult time, they don't need your silver lining on their hard time. To make it even worse, there were many people that believed that this woman's condition was due to some sin that she had committed. There's still people that believe dumb things like this, and they say, if you just had more faith, or if you just hadn't done that, then maybe you wouldn't experience this. Once again, those people think quite differently when they get sick. Don't be like that in those situations. One of the most painful consequences of this woman's illness was the inability to be around other people, because a woman that was bleeding was considered to be unclean. It didn't matter that her bleeding didn't end after a few days or weeks. It went on for 12 years. She was unclean for 12 years. If she touched anyone, they became unclean. She couldn't go to the temple. She couldn't be in a relationship. She couldn't be around other women in the neighborhood. She was just sick. And she wasn't only sick, she was an outcast. She had heard the stories about Jesus, though. She'd heard how Jesus had touched an unclean leper and made him clean, instantly healed. Could that be true? Would Jesus actually touch a leper? Would Jesus actually be able to heal an unclean leper? If so, could there possibly be hope for her situation? She had gotten her hopes up so many times throughout the years just to be let down. But it's hard to believe that Jesus would touch a leper. Nobody does that. It would take a miracle. But what if it was true? What if Jesus could heal her? What if something could happen and the hope began to be birthed in her once again? And then one day she heard that Jesus was coming to town. The woman watched from a distance because she couldn't get near. She just had to look from the outside. What if people recognized her? What if they kicked her out? What if they stopped her from getting to Jesus? She couldn't allow that to happen. She realized that she had nothing to lose. This was her chance. This was going to be her opportunity. And if she could just touch Jesus like he had touched the leper, Hope began to rise in her. He merely touched the leper, and that leper was healed. So in verse 27, we see that she'd heard about Jesus. So she came up behind him through the crowd, and she touched his robe. For she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. With her last bit of strength, could you imagine, as weak as she was, as sick as she was, the toll that the 12 years had taken on her, she pushed through this large crowd. And she knew that suddenly, instantly, something happened. Verse 29, immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she'd been healed of the terrible condition. She was cured. She was instantly healed by the power of God. Jesus stopped walking. The crowd came to a halt. There's some kind of commotion. What's going on? Verse 30, Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him. So he turned around in the crowd and he asked, who touched my robe? I can imagine that her heart began to beat a little bit faster because she knew that it was her. She was the one that was in the sights of Jesus that he was looking for. She was trembling. She was thinking about what she had done. And she told Jesus what had happened. And Jesus listened to her. And then his word brought instant comfort and peace to her life and her situation. In verse 34, he says, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, your suffering is over. And just that quickly, she was healed and pronounced clean, healed in her body, healed in her heart, given another chance at life after 12 years of wandering. What had ever happened? Imagine being able to go to the temple, being able to touch people. Imagine those hugs. She would never be the same. Not only that, but can you imagine her family that received the family member back? If you know someone that's going through a long-term illness, show compassion and concern for them. Let them know that you're praying for them. And actually pray for them, but also care for their family. Pray for their family and let their family know that you're thinking about them as they're going through it also. You may not always know what to do or what to say or how to show care, but there's some things that you can try not to do. And the first of those is don't make a joke out of it. It's probably not very funny. Sometimes people in those situations, they'll make a joke out of it. That's fine. That's their right to do it, not someone from the outside. Don't offer to help if you don't mean it. Don't Google their symptoms and give your diagnosis and tell them about the people that just died from the exact same thing that happened to them. The thing is, you don't always have to have the right thing to say, and you don't have to always say anything at all. Just be there. Back to our story that was interrupted by this woman. It's incredible what Jesus did for her. She's been suffering for 12 years. She's healed. All the while, Jairus is thinking about his 12-year-old daughter who's dying. The crowd had already slowed. Jesus' progress had come to a halt considerably. Now every precious second that's spent, every question that's asked, every interaction between Jesus and this woman, all the questions from the crowd, all of it takes an eternity for this desperate father. Imagine how frustrating it must have been for Jairus. Time was of the essence, since his daughter was at the point of death. Not wanting to begrudge this woman of her amazing miracle that Jesus had done for her, but at the same time wondering if the miracle that his daughter needed would arrive in time. And then as he's plagued with all these doubts in his mind, his worst fears become a reality. In verse 35, while he was still speaking to her, Jesus to the woman, the messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, and they told him, your daughter is dead. There's no use in troubling the teacher now. It's too late. Don't bother anymore, one translation says. But Jesus ignored what they said, and he gave Jairus two commands in verse 36. Don't be afraid, and just have faith. Can you imagine in that situation? He had tracked down Jesus. He'd gone to find him. They were on the way. He's thinking, man, we're never going to get there with this big crowd. And then this interruption. And then the bad news that it's too late. And Jesus says, don't be afraid, just have faith. But his daughter is literally dead. They continue this journey to Jairus' home, and all these things are going through his mind as they approach. No doubt he heard the mourners as they got close to the house. And Jairus began to sense the emotions within him, all the while trying to remember and think about what Jesus had just told him, to not be afraid and to just have faith. But as they arrived at the house, the reality began to set in. Jairus' wife is looking at them, confirming it was too late. The house was filled with weeping and mourning. And Jesus goes into the house and he begins to look around and begins to ask what all this commotion is about. And he says to the crowd that's there, the girl is not dead, she's just sleeping. And in fact, the mourners, upon hearing this, they stopped mourning and they began laughing and mocking what Jesus had said, because they know a dead girl when they see one. So Jesus put them out of the house and he went into where the 12-year-old girl was. She's lying peacefully, but her chest is not moving. There's no sound coming from her. Jesus went to her bedside and he knelt down beside her. And he took her little hand in his hand and he said, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And in verse 42, the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. And they were overwhelmed and totally amazed. Can you imagine for a moment the response of Jairus and his wife? He no longer had any questions about Jesus. And I can only imagine that his entire family, and likely some of the mourners who had mocked what Jesus said, were now lifelong followers of Jesus, because they'd seen him do the impossible. They'd seen him do the miraculous. The miracle that they needed came from him. And if you're in a long-term battle or you're in a situation that's very painful and difficult and it seems like it's hopeless and helpless, there's a few things that we can learn from this. And the first thing I want you to know is don't let anything keep you from Jesus. Jairus had to overcome his peers. He had to overcome his belief system, his fears, and he did it all. He risked it all to go to Jesus. This woman who suffered for 12 years, she had to overcome her shame and her disappointment, her discouragement and the disapproval of others. But she did that and she reached out and touched Jesus. They both had to overcome their doubts and the temptation to say, "Don't bother anymore. It's too late. It's been 12 years. My daughter's already dead. It's been too long. It's no use." But because they didn't let their doubts keep them from Jesus, they received the miracle that they needed. And they overcame it all and they ran to Jesus. Philippians 3:13 and 14 says, "No, dear brothers and sisters, I've not achieved it, but I focus on this one thing, forgetting the past and looking forward to what lies ahead. I press on to reach the end of the race, to receive the heavenly prize for which God, through Christ Jesus, is calling us." I press on to what lies ahead. I will make my way to Jesus. I'm going to push through, is what it's saying. And I don't know what it is in your life that may be keeping you from going to Jesus and keeping you from receiving all that he has for you. But I want you to know today that if you just get to Jesus, all the other things that make so much sense from a rational viewpoint that wants to tell you that those are the reasons why it doesn't matter if you get there or not, if you just can get to Jesus. Overcome the doubts, overcome the surroundings, overcome your upbringing, overcome whatever it is that's keeping you from Jesus and get to him. I know that in your life you have your doubts as well. Don't let them keep you from Jesus. Don't let anything keep you from Jesus. When you struggle with doubt or you wonder if there ever is going to be an answer in your situation, if the battle seems endless and you're not sure your prayers are being heard, I want you to know that you can trust God. Just get to Jesus. You wonder what other people will think. You worry that if you keep going down for prayer for the same thing over and over again and you haven't been healed, that they'll begin to ask questions. Don't let any of that keep you from Jesus. What God has for you is so much greater than what people will think about you or say about you. And most of the time, those thoughts about what people will say and think are discouragement that the enemy wants to use in your life to keep you from Jesus. Even if what they say has a basis in truth, push through the crowd, push past your pride, and get to Jesus. You've seen other people healed and blessed, and you've thought, maybe what about me? And the second thing I want to encourage you with is that God has not forgotten you. So many amazing things about this chapter of Scripture. Jesus wasn't in such a hurry to get to Jairus' house that he overlooked the woman who had been suffering for 12 years. And although all she did was touch the hem of his robe, he acknowledged her and he healed her. Jairus is likely thinking, what about my daughter who's only 12 years old and is dying? And Jesus takes time out for a woman who he calls his daughter, who had suffered for 12 years. And it didn't matter that the woman was by society standards an outcast and that Jairus was a well-known religious leader. It didn't matter any of those things. 2 daughters. 2 stretches of 12 years. 2 situations where it's going to take a miracle. I want you to know today, regardless of your standing in society, regardless of who you think you are, how prominent that you think that you may be, or how much of an outcast that you may think that you are, how far that you may think that you've been from God, none of that matters to him. He'll stop everything for you if you just will press through to where he is. Job 34:19 says he doesn't care how great a person may be. He pays no more attention to the rich than to the poor because he made them all. It's easy to think of all the time we spend waiting as wasted. Sometimes it's hard to argue that it's not. 6 months of our lives will be spent waiting on traffic lights to turn green. That's wasted. 6 months of our lives is spent dealing with junk mail. That's wasted. Up to 2 years of our lives is spent calling people who don't answer. Maybe leaving voicemails that people are never going to listen to. Waiting on God isn't wasted because God has not forgotten you. Waiting on God isn't laziness. Waiting on God isn't unproductive. We often associate inactivity and waiting and all that goes along with that with a lack of faith or a lack of action. But I want you to understand that waiting is faith in action. Your waiting is not a lack of faith. Your waiting is not in vain. The journey that you're on is not wasted. God knows exactly where you are and precisely what you need. His word tells us that he'll never leave us. He'll never forsake us. I don't know how long you've been praying for a miracle in your situation. I don't know how long you've been fighting the battle that you're fighting, but I do believe that today could be the day that you receive the miracle that you need from God because he has not forgotten you and he's not overlooking you if you'll just press into where he is. God's able. The final thing I want you to know today is that it's never too late. The woman had likely told herself that she was going to be this way for the rest of her life. She had prayed and believed and had hope, and she'd tried everything. She'd probably given up many times. 4,380 days is a long time to be waiting for a miracle, but thank God that she didn't give up on day 4,379. She pressed through the crowd on day 4,380 and reached out to Jesus in faith, and it wasn't too late for her. Jairus' messenger arrives and says, "Don't bother anymore." Jesus had allowed an interruption to delay them. He had allowed precious time to pass. That to Jairus was the difference between life and death. The way that everyone saw it, Jesus was too late. It's reminiscent of John chapter 11 when Lazarus was sick and they go to Jesus and he doesn't immediately go. And he waits until after his friend Lazarus was dead and then he goes. And Martha says, if you had just been here, he wouldn't have died. Because that's the way that we look at it from our human perspective, that it's too late. Jesus seemed to have a way of showing up too late from a human perspective, and it still happens in our day today because we think that we should control the way and the time in which God should move. Jairus' family said, "Don't bother anymore." Jesus doesn't see things the way that we do. 2 Corinthians 4:18 says, so that we don't look at the troubles that we can see now. Rather, we fix our gaze on things that cannot be seen. For the things we see now will soon be gone, but the things that we cannot see will last forever. Don't fix your eyes on the situation. Don't fix your eyes on the report that says it's too late. Don't pay attention to the voices that want to tell you that it's way beyond time, that you don't need to bother anymore, that you should just give up. It was never too late. Jesus wasn't worried about Jairus' daughter dying because he knew all along that he was going to heal her. Even if it meant raising her from the dead, in a beautiful act of mercy, Jesus stops to care for the woman in the crowd that reached out to him in faith and in desperation. And that should be something that gives hope to us today. That no matter how long that you have suffered and waited and prayed and tried every other thing, if you just will reach out to Jesus, that he'll stop everything in an instant for you and for your situation. Shakespeare said, better 3 hours too soon than 1 minute too late. And if it was our daughter or if Lazarus was our brother, we would agree. But Jesus doesn't agree because God doesn't view time how we view time. He's not confined by 24 hours or 365 days or by the limited scope of our natural lives. He doesn't see the world as the way in which we do. God's never in a hurry, but he's always on time. It may just not be our time. But God's not subject to our time. Sometimes God requires patience from us. Sometimes the wait is longer than we like, and it's longer than we feel is rational. And sometimes God allows temporary loss and setback in order to show us the eternal abundance of his blessing. But God is not too late to your situation today. The worship team will come and just begin to play softly. I want to wrap up with this morning. It's not too late, and God has not forgotten you. So don't let anything keep you from Jesus. Maybe this morning you're here and you've prayed and you've waited and you've said it's going to take a miracle. And then you've prayed for that miracle. And maybe you've watched and other people have seemed to cut to the front of the line and receive their miracle while all the while you're still waiting for yours. Maybe the circumstances look bleak and you've reached a point of giving up hope. Maybe you've contemplated even saying, don't bother anymore. Maybe you've just stopped bothering anymore. Today I want to encourage you with the same thing that Jesus told Jairus. Don't be afraid, just believe. Don't be afraid, just believe. Press through the crowd to get to Jesus one more time. Pray one more time. Don't give up. Don't buy the lie of the enemy. Rather, listen to what Jesus said in Matthew 7:7. Keep on asking, and you'll receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking, and you'll find. Keep on knocking, and the door will be open unto you. Eyes on the problem will always tell you, don't bother anymore. Eyes on the promise will always remind you that God is faithful. I want to encourage you today, if the heaviness of what you've been walking through, if the heaviness of what you've been carrying has caused you to put your eyes on the problem, today would you refocus your eyes on the promise? Would you refocus your eyes on the one who is able, in spite of every lie of the enemy, in spite of everything that you've been through, in spite of every shortcoming and discouragement and failure in the past? Would you put your eyes on the one who's able in your situation to come through and accomplish and fulfill the promise in your life? It may appear to you that all hope is dead, but God is in the resurrection business. Let him first resurrect the hope inside of you, and then let him do what you thought was impossible. If you're here and you're at a point of giving up, if you're here and you're at a point of it's going to take a miracle, only a miracle will do. And I want to encourage you today. Let God do the miracle in your life. Let him do the miracle in your situation. Put your faith fully in him. Don't be afraid, just believe. And allow God to do what he wants to do. Will you stand all over this place?